For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Journalist and author Karin and Colonel Johannes Vrechtenberg, known as Tolly, are with me to discuss Karin's compelling book, The High Treason Club, which for the first time tells the complete story of the Boeremag, a far-right white Afrikaner extreme group, 23 members of which were tried for high treason after they detonated 8 bombs in Soweto, resulting in the death of Claudia Makone. Karin, to begin, could you tell us how you got involved in this case, which turned out to be the longest running and most expensive criminal trial in South African history?
Well, it's actually not really a fascinating story. It's actually just a stroke of luck. So I was a brand new intern radio journalist in 2011 when I got deployed to the Boeremag trial when it resumed after a recess. So the trial was already in its 8th year at this time, and the media interest had just dwindled, which you can understand. So I got sent there. My office said, you need to go and get a hang of court reporting. And I certainly did. I was there for about 3 months every single day to try and understand how court applications worked, etc., etc. And when you're in a courtroom for that long and nothing substantial is really happening, I just sat and I started to observe the men in the dock. And obviously the mind starts to wonder. You wonder, what is it like being behind bars for 8 years already at this time? And you notice the families that bring in food parcels and the interactions between families and the accused in the dock. So that's very much what prompted my interest in the story itself.
And Tolly, you were deeply embedded in this investigation, but gaining information from the close-knit community was difficult, as they often hid on large farms and moved easily across provincial borders. How did you go about tracking them down?
That was quite difficult. The community completely closed, although I'm staying in the same community as where most of the suspects originate from. But they completely closed down. So we had to depend on primitive classical intelligence work, monitoring, following, do observation on family members, on friends, on persons that they were previously involved in different spheres of life. These guys went primitive. They never used a cell phone. In the first stage, during the bombing stage, they never used a cell phone. So for us to trace cell phones like today, the opportunity was not there. And eventually we, by a brilliant recruitment by one of the crime intelligence members, we recruited a person that was close to the group, one of the group's friends. I'm speaking about the November-December bomber group. On the 10th of December, he lowered into an ambush that we set up for them in Pretoria, and we arrested 2 of them. And from there on, the normal detective work started. And by 1 o'clock the next day, we arrested the last bomber and found 2.5 tons of explosives. Later in the case, during the trial, 2 of them escaped from prison. Now, that's what made us a bit easier. At that stage, the technology was also a bit farther ahead. And we managed to import the first grabber technological machine that can trace the real location of a cell phone. By that time, also the suspects, the 2 of us on the run, started having contacts with their family via cell phone. And although it took us 8 months, we used that technology to pinpoint them and eventually arrest them in a flat in Centurion in Pretoria.
Your book explores many layers. Can you provide some background on the ideology and beliefs that motivated the Boeremag, including how they perceived their Boer identity?
So I think this is a very important question for anybody who is only seeing the cover of the book, but who has no context of what the full story is about. And that's just to go back a little bit. So for me as a brand new journalist on the scene of this court case, I relied heavily on newspaper articles to just try and place myself within this trial of which characters belonged where and what exactly happened. But what I found frustrating was that there was no record from A to Z telling me what the Boeremag was, what they believed and why they did what they did. It was all just 2 or 3 sentences in every article saying basically just the broad strokes of the case. So once you start looking at the Boeremag, it's definitely not just a term that you can throw around loosely, as you see on social media when people refer to right-winger, radical, or extremist groups. It is definitely an ideology that was connected to this specific group. So they were radical, they were extreme, and they were definitely nationalists. But when you look at the Boer identity of it, there's a deep connection to the Israel vision, which is a belief mythology that people follow. And essentially, it's people who believe that white Afrikaners and the Boer people are part of the lost tribes of Israel. And when you look at the Israel vision, it all comes down to this nation being a supreme nation, they're God's chosen people, and it comes down to white supremacy at the end of the day. But it's also when you look at that connection, that is why the Boeremag was so convinced that God was going to be with them, with their plans. No matter when we look at it 20 years later, everybody thinks these people were crazy, or their plans were crazy. But when you look at that deep conviction of God is going to be with us, they fully believed that God was going to be with them. Another part of what drove the Boeremag is definitely Siener van Rensburg's visions. So this was early 2000s, and if you just place it in context, that was after the Zimbabwe land reforms. South Africans were very much concerned about what was happening in Zimbabwe. It was the start of strike season as we know it now, 20 years later. To us, it makes sense now. Back then, it was still very new and the concerns were also very real. So the Boeremag started to interpret Siener's visions, and they thought the visions are becoming the truth. We need to do something here. And in one of Siener's visions, or in a few of them, he essentially sees or prophesizes that there's going to be a mass black on white onslaught in the country. And with this group seeing in their own terms that the visions are becoming a reality, they decided we need to take control of this black on white onslaught. And they wanted to trigger the onslaught themselves so that they could be in control once it happened.
Tolly, the Boeremag were heavily influenced, as Karin said, by the prophecies of Siener van Rensburg. So much so that they even plotted the assassination of Nelson Mandela. Could you elaborate on that plot and how you came to uncover it?
So, during our hunt for them, they read in a newspaper that Madiba is going to open a school in the Bolobedo area up north, close to Mujaji Janin area. They went there for a reconnaissance. And they found the school, and they saw there was only one road leading to the school. They prepared a 65-kilogram ammonium nitrate bomb that they placed in a culvert on that road, and they were laying in waiting for a hand detonator for Madiba's convoy to cross that culvert, and they would have detonated it. By the grace of God, Madiba was not feeling well that day, and he flew in with a helicopter. He opened the school and he flew out of the helicopter. We were not aware of it. We only found it out after the fact. When one of the bombers by the name of Dion Kraus, that I convinced to be a state witness, told me about that. And I went to the GPSs that they had, and I saw a waypoint in the Mujaji area. I sent some of my members there, and they found, they took a photo exactly at the spot where the bombs would have been placed. Then they, in a surrounding area, they did some inquiries, and they confirmed that Mandela was there on a certain day. They confirmed with the local policemen that they did saw white people in honor uniforms in the bushes there, but they didn't consider them as a threat. But yes, that was the country, the world, dodged a bullet on that day.
Karin, there's a striking moment in your book where convicted member Mike the Toy congratulates his brother Andre and welcomes him to what he calls the High Treason Club, even posing for a photo. Can you tell us about that incident and how you came to interview Mike, who was said to be the mastermind behind the Boeremag?
Absolutely. So this is definitely one of my highlights of the memories that I take from the trial. This was in 2012, so I'd already been covering the trial for about a year. And I have always loved fading into the background. I don't like to be seen. I don't like to be heard. I just observe. So for that first year, I was literally just trying to find my place in this trial and basically connect people to establish how this entire story worked. It was the day after Mike was found guilty that his brother Andre was also found guilty. And I remember I stood up thinking, I hope I'm going to try and get some sound from the two brothers after both of them have been found guilty. And as I stood up in the seat, I saw Mike standing up, shaking his brother's hand and laughing. And he said, "Welcome to the High Treason Club." And I remember I just stood there and it felt as if my heart had dropped into my shoes because it was such an important moment and I did not have the sound because I was a radio journalist and that was crucial. So I walked up to the dock and very shyly asked them, "Is there any way that you could please just repeat this moment?" And Mike was very happy to do it. And I think the photographers were also very happy because suddenly all of the media were around them as they were reenacting this moment. But as you can tell, that obviously resulted in the title of the book, which I think so perfectly encapsulates what this trial had become, the camaraderie and just how they were a club and also how they were able to laugh about being found guilty of high treason in that very moment. So it was as a result of me asking Mike whether he could reenact the moment that there was a certain level of familiarity that was established that day. And it was a few days later, I walked into court as I always did, but I went to the front of the dock and took a photo with my iPhone of all of the accused standing in the dock before court proceedings started. And I just heard Mike speaking to me and I had to do a double take. And then I realized he was talking to me. And he said, "Is that a phone that you're taking photos with?" And I said, "Yes," but I was very confused. And then he said, "But where are the buttons?" And then I showed him the phone and he said, "I haven't seen a phone since 2002. And that moment, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized somebody had been so out of touch with what was happening outside in civilization that he hadn't seen a phone in 10 years and had to ask me where the buttons were, that I turned around and showed him that we now work with touchscreens. And so as a result of that, I said, "Thank you, sir," or I started calling Mike sir, and he said, "You don't have to call me sir, you can call me Mike." And that is definitely also where the exchanges with Mike grew. And I got more comfortable conversing with him while he was standing in the dock. And I think it was the next day that I said I would really love to interview the Boeremag in prison because I definitely thought it was important for South Africa to know what the experience was like for them behind bars. I had no idea how one does that, how you organize to go into prison, but being a new intern, I just asked questions. And so I asked him whether I could go in, and he said that he would find out. And the next day when I walked into court, his lawyer came over and he handed me a folded piece of paper. And at the very moment that I wanted to open it, Judge Eben Jordan came into the courtroom. And any journalist knows that once the judge enters the courtroom, you look at him and you do your little bow and it's all of the court etiquette, but you cannot be distracted. So this letter was literally just burning a hole in my hand. And as soon as the judge sat down, I unfolded it while I was still standing. And it was a handwritten letter from Mike saying, "Karin, you're welcome to come and visit me in prison this weekend." And obviously I jumped at the opportunity, which I also described my first experience going into prison in depth. But yes, so the interviews with Mike lasted until 2016, early 2017. So whenever I had an off Sunday or an off Saturday, I would ask Mike whether there would be a possibility for me to go and visit. And I would just go in, but it's also, I didn't ask very heavy questions. It was not about trying to understand Mike's ideals. It was about trying to just place him in prison and what prison life is like.
Tali, if you could speak to the impact that this case had on your family and the safety measures you had to implement to protect them.
Yes, during that time I was staying in Wombas, now called Bella Bella. During the time my children were still young. My son was grade 1 or grade 2. My eldest daughter was a teenager. And she was in high school. And unfortunately, in the high school, the local high school where she was, accused number 2 was a teacher. Accused number 18's mother-in-law was an Afrikaans teacher. Accused number 17's wife was a maths teacher. So I can go on and on and on. All my children are very talented in sports, and partners in the sport teams were in some way involved in the Boeremag itself and the family next of kin friend group. So we had to face that challenge. And after I was requested to take over the case as a lead investigating officer, I had a family meeting and we talked about it. But the outcome of that is that, typical to my family, we decided we are not going to be anyways intimidated. We are who we are, and we're going to stay where we are. Brave words to say, but there's still a threat outside. And there was a serious threat, especially on my eldest daughter, Esmeralda. So during a matric farewell, I had to arrange a special task force member to act not as a date, but to act as a chaperone at the after party. That is, the most important thing of a matric farewell is not the farewell, it's the after party. But outside my house, there was a police van with the armed police stationed for 10 years. I myself had close protection, but I quickly dropped it. I told them that that's very, very invasive of your privacy. So I could look after myself. The way that we mitigated the threat is that as my daughter was bullied in school by the teachers that didn't like her, I went to the principal and said, call in all those teachers. And all of them were appointed by government appointed teachers. If you want to keep your job, stop this. I'm in a position to have you fired for this. And I was in a position, I just had to say 1 or 2 words to the necessary powers and they would have been fired. But we arranged that the class has been taken over by persons that was not hostile towards her. And also what is important at both schools, the primary school as well as the high school, we had to arrange for a safe person inside the school. Whenever one of the kids feels threatened, they had to run to that person and that person have a direct line to me. And if there's a call, there was plans in place to lift that children. And same here at the house, there was cameras, everything was in place to safeguard the house. But the most intrusive one was the fact that there was a police van parked outside my house for 10 years.
Karin, tell us more about the Pretorius family who were on trial, a father and 3 sons.
Right, so the Pretorius family stood out for obvious reasons. When I walked into court, I knew that there were 20 plus accused at that stage. But it was so interesting when I was reading in the newspapers the night before until 3 a.m. that morning that apparently there's a father and 3 sons who are accused together. So that immediately drew me in. And when I got to the court, and I described this in the book as well, Dr. Let, who is the father, actually introduced himself to me while I was sitting in the waiting area because he was out on bail. And walked into the courtroom, saw him stepping into the dock, and there were his 3 sons. So you've got Dr. Let, who's the father, then you've got Johan Pretorius, who's also a doctor, you've got Wilhelm Pretorius, who was a theology student at that stage, and then Quibus, who was farming. He had an agricultural engineering degree, if I'm not mistaken, Tolly. But so this is the family, and then in the public gallery, there would always be this constant presence of Minnie Pretorius, who is the mother. So it was very interesting for me to be able to observe this family and look at the family dynamics as it's literally playing out in a courtroom and over court benches. That is how public this relationship was. And there is also a chapter in the book that is dedicated to exploring the intricacies of this family. But I will leave that to the reader to go and have a look at. So essentially with the family, you've got Dr. Letts, who would have been obviously being a medically trained doctor. If once the Boeremag had triggered the chaos in the country, he would be there for casualties, etc., and to look after the Boeremag. But then you've got the three sons who were all very heavily involved in the last phase of the Boeremag's activities across the country. They were all involved with the planting of the bombs, and also Cobus Pretorius was known as the bomb maker.
Tolly, the book is filled with astonishing stories, from how the accused used their time in prison to get fit and strong, to prepare for a courtroom escape, by filling nasal spray bottles with a mixture of ammonia, cayenne pepper, handy Andy and domestos to spray into the eyes of the court security. What moment stands out to you as the most memorable in the hunt for the Boeremag?
So there's two moments that stands out for me. It's the arrest of the last group during 2002 on the 11th of December at the farm up north in the Popo Straitpond. When I landed there with a few helicopters and special task force members, it was like a movie. They descended with fast rope down to the ground, and I had to pull the rope for the fast rope, and I had to land, and I arrested them there, and I found 2.5 tons of explosives there. And I saw the plan of what would have happened 2 days later, because 2 days later, on the 30th of December, they exploded 4 car bombs consisting of 300 kilograms each all over Gauteng. That was one of the highest points. The second highlight for me is after Van Rooyen and Gous escaped, and we were on a run for 8 months, and all the work that we put into that and tracing them, the night when we arrested them. Thirdly, when they attempted the second escape from court. Now that was foiled by the fact that we had at that stage, one of the accused in custody came to us and told us that these guys are planning a next escape. So we developed a protection plan. We moved our protection plan a bit around. We created 3 layers of security. One inside the court, because the plan was to overpower those guys inside, the policemen inside the court, by spraying them with those nasal spray in their eyes and taking their firearms from them. So we removed all the policemen inside the court's firearms. The second layer was just in the foyer. There was policemen and police ladies armed with firearms as well as taser guns. And then the third offense was outside in the street. So the moment when they tried to escape, they did spray the members inside, but luckily only 2 managed to get through the doors. Tom Foster was hit by one of the female police officers behind the head with a firearm, and he was unconscious. Herman van Rooyen managed to escape. He broke the glass doors of the High Court and he ran into the street. But as his luck is, Constable Nkosi, who was one of the police's long-distance champions, he went on his trail, and assisting him was all the car guards on Church Square that know me very well because all the years I'm standing there. And between Constable Nkosi and the car guards, they arrested him about 500 meters from the court's front door and brought him back. So that was a huge relief. It caused much more grey hair on my head, but the fact that our plan that worked that day. Unfortunately, some of my members that get serious injuries in their eyes, but they all recovered nicely on that.
And finally, Karin, after spending years covering this case, how has the experience changed you? And what would you say is the most important takeaway from the experience?
Where to start? So when I walked into the courtroom, I was 22 years old. I was fresh out of university. Obviously, you think you know everything about the world. And I also say in the book how when I walked in, I wasn't very keen on covering this subject, actually, because I had no time for right-wingers, especially being white and Afrikaans myself. It was very tough walking in there and seeing this dock full of people who are accused of trying to kill Nelson Mandela, who, for me, as a 5-year-old at the time of democracy in our country, he was a hero. So it was very much an internal struggle throughout this process of covering the trial. But in the book, I say that I walked in and I judged each and every single one of those men. And here we are 14 years later. I'm now on the wrong side of 30, not so close to the 20s anymore. And I've definitely learned that there's so much value in sitting down and actually just silencing your own voice and trying to understand what makes other people believe what they believe. And it's so much more valuable when you can sit around a table or sit across from somebody who's in prison and you listen and you try to understand. And that's also with journalism, I always try to understand a situation. So whether I'm talking to a high treasonist or somebody in Marikana, for example, I will give you that same opportunity to tell me your story. So it was very much after finding out about all of the individual Boeremag members' stories, and this came much later during the research of the book, that I started to realize, why was Herman thinking what he was thinking? Why did Mike think the way that he thought? So it was tapping into their backgrounds and how they grew up, and Pretorius, for example, where you get an understanding for why a person thinks and acts the way that they do. So the experience that I took from it was definitely, do not judge anybody, even if you think you know everything. You know nothing. You need to be able to sit down and just delve into the story. My most important takeaway from the story is, for me, it's been an absolute honor to finally put this story on paper. While covering the trial, I always thought it would be such a shame for this important part of our history to go lost if nobody knew about it. I mean, it is a historical trial, and it's been an absolute honor. As much as it's been a challenge, it's been an honor to actually just... The thing is, it's not just the 23 Boeremag accused, it's not just the prosecutors, it's not just the investigating team who spent 10 plus years of their lives on this. There were the families on the other side of the dock. There was Tolly's family, there were prosecutors' families. There's obviously Claudia Makone's family. So it was bringing all of those stories together, and I hope that I did it justice.
That was Karin Mitchell and Tolly Vrechtenberg discussing the High Treason Club.